Welcome to How Gear Changed the Game, an exploration of the role gear has in the change, growth, evolution, and outcome of the sports that we love. I'm your host, Alex Kindig-Sherman, bringing you episode 2 of what is a multi-part series on the football helmet and the role it had in the evolution of the game throughout the years. Now, in the previous episode, which if you haven't checked out, you should do that before moving forward, we covered a lot of things early on in the game of football, from its origins just after the Civil War to the formation of different rules, how the rise of critics informed those changes of rules, as well as the popularity of the game expanding during that time, colleges expanding, and with the rule changes changing the conditions of the game and with injuries being what they were, well, that meant equipment came along. Now, coaches and players were inventing their own types of helmets. We covered those from James Naismith to Joseph Bull Reeves to the Larwood helmet to Charles Barkley and his striking resemblance to Christian Bale. Yeah. Does that entice you to check out episode 1? Uh-huh. Yeah. We covered Robert Zupke and his invention of the Zupke helmet in 1917 and how its suspension system changed the way that helmets would be made from that point forward. And we covered not just how the helmet is made and what it does in the game, we also covered how helmets get painted. Well, at least the beginnings of it. Plenty of colleges and schools had tried painting their helmets, but when a helmet is made of flexible leather, it's tough to keep that paint on there without it flaking off from contact or movement. But Fritz Chrysler saw an advantage in painting the helmet. He said it allowed players to see each other amidst all the chaos of a game and allows for a quarterback to quickly identify his targets. When he went to Michigan in 1938, he had their reinforced fiber helmets painted with yellow on the reinforced fiber parts and Michigan blue on the leather parts. That design was the winged helmet. And it is still, to this very day, the same painted design you will see on Michigan football helmets. But at the time in 1938, that was so new, so different, and because it was part of something successful, it caught on. And now, the painted design that we see on helmets are iconic, synonymous with the game of football. And we ended the last episode covering the invention of a plastic called Tenite. And that Tenite would be used for all kinds of things, for steering wheels and automobiles and dashboards, to making appliances and telephones, to somebody in Evanston, Illinois named John T. Riddell seeing potential in this Tenite to create something for football, the plastic helmet. And the plastic helmet, the creation of it and the implementation of it is a game changer when it comes to football. So in this episode, we're going to be covering how a plastic helmet changed the game into what it is today. So let's find out how gear changed the game. Sometimes new innovation in gear just isn't ready to catch on in the conditions it's initially introduced into. Like the tank. It first came into play in World War I. On September 16, 1916, the Allies first deployed tanks during the Battle of Somme. Of the 32 that were put into battle that day, only 9 made it across no man's land and onto enemy lines. They didn't cover terrain all that well to start, and they'd get stuck, they'd break down, and basically become sitting ducks. And the whole program was almost scrapped, but an old British general who spent his young years leading the cavalry saw tanks as the new cavalry, the new way to support infantry in winning battles. Before the tank, if you wanted to advance, you needed a big mass of soldiers to push their way through. You couldn't send just, say, 4 soldiers to the line to try and break through with just rifles and bayonets. That's basically suicide. But if those 4 soldiers are in a strong armored vehicle, they can withstand contact from the enemy and become much more powerful and effective in breaking through enemy lines. Now, throughout the war, as it went on, the design improved, they became more useful, more effective, but they didn't become a decisive and crucial part of battle until toward the end of the war. And by World War II, it was a very crucial part of any unit trying to advance their lines forward. Same with aviation. Planes were being used in war by 1911. That was just 9 years after the first flight of the Wright brothers. And while biplanes in World War I were useful with reconnaissance or strafing front lines, which led to vicious aerial battles, dogfights, planes weren't all that decisive. I mean, they just had a couple of bombs that they could drop out of the cockpit, and they had a front-mounted machine gun. And machine gun positions would be placed toward the back of the fuselage toward the end of the war. But again, a lot of advancements needed to be made in order to have an effect on the current conditions it was working in. It was primitive, but by the time we get to World War II, some aviation thought leaders like Billy Mitchell, Curtis LeMay, Jimmy Doolittle, they were talking about how bombing was the key. Now, during these couple of decades in between World War I and World War II, planes had advanced quite a bit. Instead of painted canvas fuselages, they were made out of lightweight aluminum. Instead of crappy engines, you had powerful, innovative engines with a much larger range. It wasn't just about attacking the front lines or strafing the front lines, but to use your planes and your bombers to go deep into enemy territory, to hit their factories, to level their industrial centers, but also to hit their cities. You could cut off the enemy's supply lines and weaken them that way, and you could weaken the resolve of their people by bringing the horrors of the front line miles away from it and into their cities. So by 1941, we had the idea of not only using planes as bombers, but how are they going to ward off planes trying to shoot them down? They decided to put machine gun emplacements throughout the fuselage, top, the bottom, both sides, the tail, the front. So many machine gun positions on a single plane that they would be deemed a flying fortress. That was the name of the B-17. The idea was that hopefully they could fly deep into enemy territory without the need for an escort from fighter planes who didn't have the range in 1941 to follow the bombers all the way to the target and all the way back. Sometimes the bombers would have to be on their own and would need to protect themselves. But they're a flying fortress, right? Well, again, when you introduce something new, everything else has to adapt, and the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, did adapt. They found gaps in the B-17's machine gun coverage, and in 1942, when they were flying into battle, the Messerschmitts of the Luftwaffe would appear out of the sun and exploit those gaps in the machine gun coverage and rip formations into shreds. In 1942, when Americans started doing their daytime bombing runs over Europe, if you were in a B-17 as a pilot or a crew member, your odds of returning from that mission was 1 out of 4. And no, I don't have that reversed. Your chances of being shot down on a B-17 was 75%. The idea of bombing and the creation of planes like the B-17 was innovative, but it needed improvement. It needed add-ons like the P-51, which would come later in the war. It was faster, had longer range, better firepower, and was finally able to outmatch the power of the Messerschmitts. Improvement and innovation move fast when you're facing annihilation. The idea since the beginning of the war from these thought leaders was that strategic bombing was the key. And there was doubt as planes were being ripped to shreds and a lot of planes were getting shot out of the air at a very high rate. So you keep thinking of ways to make your strategic bombing more and more effective, reduce your losses while increasing your firepower. In 1945, the atom bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And 3 years prior to those bombs being dropped, neither the atomic bomb nor the B-29s that dropped them even existed. Again, innovation moves fast when you're facing annihilation. Those two innovations, the atomic bomb and the B-29, were things that no one else had, and it added to what was already an effective strategy and turned it into unconditional victory. But make no mistake, it was the bravery and sacrifice of the troops that won the war, but it was the strategic use of innovative tools for war that ended it. Now, you may be wondering where in the world I'm going with all of this stuff, and you may have been wondering that last episode too, but all of this ties together. It's not just the mindset of innovation and strategy. There's an even closer correlation than that, as we're about to find out. Innovations in football are going to help people on the front lines. And in fact, the atomic bomb being developed through a top secret program called the Manhattan Project, well, it got its start in Chicago thanks to one of the brightest coaching minds in football at the time losing his job. This guy crossed paths with something that he would have been fascinated by had he known about it, had anyone known about it. For decades, it was classified for a long time. Now, this coach was an enthusiastic study of the tactics of war and the strategies of battle, and he knew, at some level, the concepts we just talked about here. War takes strength and power can be increased by using innovations of new tools for war in tandem with new strategies for war, and that strategies can reach a whole new level if you can get a hold of something that your opponents don't have. And that coach that lost his job's name was Clark Shaughnessy. And maybe you've heard of the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, how you can connect pretty much every actor in Hollywood to the actor Kevin Bacon by 6 degrees of separation or less. Well, consider this 1 degree of Shaughnessy. This guy's connected not only to a lot of things I just talked about in the prologue. Yeah, I talked about that stuff for a reason. We're going to get there. But he's also a connecting factor to a lot of game-changing innovation that happened in Chicagoland during the late 1930s and early 1940s. The Manhattan Project, the plastic helmet, the rise of the NFL and the Chicago Bears, and a strategy called the T formation. Shaughnessy is also connected to Amos Alonzo Stagg, a big early innovator when it comes to football strategy. And he's connected to George Halas, coach and owner of the Chicago Bears and a founding member of the NFL, who introduced innovation into the game in a number of different ways, which we're about to get to. And Shaughnessy is directly connected to equipment company founder John T. Riddell. January 15th, 1939 is a day that directly connects Shaughnessy, Halas, and Riddell. Let's take you to Wrigley Field on that day, January 15th, 1939. I'm talking about the Wrigley Field in Los Angeles. Yeah, there were 2 Wrigley Fields at that time, one in Chicago, one in LA. The one in LA was just a few blocks away from the LA Coliseum where USC plays or where the first iteration of the XFL played. Yeah, you got it by the XFL part. Yeah, I know. It was the first true NFL All-Star game being played that day, and the NFL had done All-Star games starting in 1935 to 1938, but that was Halas's effort to get the NFL more established and gain popularity over college. College football was way more popular at the time, and pro football kind of had this bad reputation as being a bunch of carny circus freaks. Maybe they were. I don't know. I wasn't there. But you had games in 1935 where Halas was saying, look, the Bears are the national champions, and if you college boys want to put together an all-star team and come and play us, well, we'll beat you. And in 1935 at Soldier Field, the Chicago Bears lost to that college all-star team. And one of the members of that all-star team that beat the Chicago Bears that day was Gerald Ford, a guy who would go on to become, yes, that's right, a professional male model. What, were you going to say president? Yeah, he became the president too, but he was a professional male model, was repped by one of the biggest modeling agencies of all time. A true story. Standards were a lot lower back then. Oh, what a time to be alive. Anyway, 1939, January 15th. It's the first true NFL All-Star game. We now know it as the Pro Bowl. This is when the plastic helmet, the biggest game changer in all of football equipment history, made its debut. And nobody talked about it. I've searched high and low looking for any source that mentions a lot or just anything in depth about a plastic helmet being used in that game. And all I've gotten is a mention that it was used in that game and a single little blurb that indirectly mentions the helmet in a recap article of that game. The Los Angeles Times stated that Ernie Pinkert was the one who actually got the All-American team their equipment, and that, quote, Brother Pinkett, who sold the All-Americans their grid armor for the game, took terrific ribbing when Isbell came off the field, his helmet smashed in. But the wisecracking Pinkett had a perfect alibi. Hey, ref, Ernie hollered, I think those giants are carrying hammers, end quote. All right, so the plastic helmet wasn't quite perfect right out of the gate, but none of us are. Quit holding yourself to that standard. You're beautiful. But the fact is that there were at least 3 people involved with the game that day that saw a game-changing potential in the football helmet. Okay, so a quick side note before we get into how this helmet changed everything and how these 3 guys were a big influence in the game of football and when it comes to the plastic helmet. I just want to do a sidebar here because this show is all about man-made things affecting the outcome of a game. This All-Star game that I'm talking about, well, the Giants ended up winning that game 13-10, but it was a man-made piece of something that completely affected and changed the outcome of the game. See, Wrigley Field is a baseball stadium, whether it was the Los Angeles one or the Chicago one. They had to squeeze a football gridiron into that stadium, which meant that sometimes the entirety of the field wasn't in play. So, as the LA Times recalls, quote, players on the losing squad were bitterly disappointed at the turn of events which cost them the victory, or at worst, a tie. In the second quarter, just before Smith tied the count with his field goal, Goddard tossed a perfect strike to Bob McChesney. The ex-Bruin end was on the verge of making a fine catch in the end zone when he crashed into the center field wall and could not hold the precious pigskin. On any other field with a full-length end zone, this would have surely been a touchdown. End quote. Yeah, a wall affected the outcome of a game. Is wall gear? Sure, why not? So yeah, just wanted to throw that out there. Okay, January 15th, 1939 is a day that connects the plastic helmet with Clark Shaughnessy, with George Halas, with John T. Riddell. And another thing that connects all three is this show. We're going to talk about all three of them, the innovation of the plastic helmet and the innovation that these folks brought to the game. Let's start with the plastic helmet and that guy named John T. Riddell. If you've ever looked at the front of a football helmet at any point since you've been watching football, you've probably seen the word Riddell, because they're pretty gosh darn good when it comes to making helmets. They invented the thing. They've been doing it since the very beginning of the plastic era. But before the Riddell Company started making helmets, and before the Riddell Company existed at all, John Tate Riddell was a high school mathematics teacher and high school football coach in Evanston, Illinois. Evanston is just north of the city of Chicago. It's at this point basically part of Chicago. Very nice town, home to Northwestern University, which will be part of the story of the plastic helmet. But in the 1920s, when Riddell was coaching and giving mathematics lessons, well, his life was going to change, not because of just his inventiveness, but because Evanston only had one cobbler. You know what a cobbler is? It's like a shoemaker, somebody that repairs shoes. See, back in the day, you just got your shoes repaired and you went to a local shop to get your shoes done. You didn't just buy new ones. You didn't just go online and order them. You didn't go to a big department store. You had to rely on the local cobbler. And when your local cobbler is the only cobbler in town and he sucks at his job, well, you got to look elsewhere for solutions. And the Evanston cobbler sucked at his job. Now, I'm going to cut him some slack. He had his work cut out for him because he had to work on the football cleats for the Evanston high school team as well as the football cleats for the Northwestern football team. And that meant that a lot of times Riddell ended up in a tough spot where his shoes weren't repaired or ready on time for that week's game. And at the time, football cleats were made out of hardened leather and varied in length. So if it was a rainy week and the field was going to be a little bit sloppy, you could nail on some extra long cleats to give you extra traction. And if the field was a little bit drier, you would make shorter cleats so that it made running a little bit easier. You wouldn't slide around. But again, you had to rely on the cobbler for that. And they had to pop off all of these cleat knobs individually and nail new ones back on. And Riddell came up with this idea. What if I could just replace all these things myself and not have to worry about this cobbler who sucks at his job? So that's how that happened. You could unscrew and screw back on different cleats. If they got damaged during a game, you could just replace it with one. If the field went from dry to sloppy and muddy, you could quickly screw it on and screw it off. And you didn't have to rely on this terrible cobbler, no matter which town you were in. And look, I'm not taking shots at cobblers here, all right? Good job. You're so good at your job that one of the most delicious desserts out there is named after you, which I don't understand how deliciousness of crispy peach or blueberry and all sorts of other ingredients in a delicious dish is somehow associated with a guy who works with smelly shoes and feet all day. But I'm not getting into that right now. We're talking about the removable cleat. The removable cleat is what got John T. Riddell his start as a, not tycoon, but innovator within the game. He was a high school football coach, but by 1927, his removable cleat business was doing so well that he quit to do that full time. And Riddell, on top of wanting to have a successful business, did move forward with the idea that he wanted to make football not only more convenient, but safer. It was during this time that he ended up working with George Halas, like I mentioned earlier, and streamlined the design of the cleat. See, most cleats sold at the time were still big, clunky work boots with hard toes, and that made it really hard for players to be agile and made it even harder when players were trying to get down in those 3 and 4 point stances. So Halas suggested that they just streamline the construction of that boot, and what you got was this nice thin layer that almost wrapped around the leg instead of being big and clunky and hard protected toes. And that made it more easy for players to move around, to get down in those stances. And those types of cleats are a lot closer to the design that we know today. To think that if Halas and Riddell had never worked together, we might still be trying to kick around a football in Timberlands. But no, the idea of a removable cleat and that ergonomic design of the boot that Riddell provided, that made it a hit among the equipment buyers at high schools and colleges. And the Riddell Company started to take off. But if you want to be successful, you got to offer more than just shoes. Somewhere along the way in the 1930s, Riddell stumbled across this invention that was made by the Eastman Company, a company in Tennessee that made chemicals for Kodak to develop film, to create film, had stumbled across a type of plastic called Tenite while they were mixing together some chemicals. And Tenite would end up being used to make dashboards for cars, steering wheels for cars, all types of different appliance shapes and phones. It made the manufacturing process a whole lot easier. At some point or another, Riddell finds out about this plastic called Tenite. A lot of sources will say that Jerry E. Morgan is how Riddell found out about Tenite. Morgan was a consultant with Riddell, a designer, an engineer, and he's the one that is kind of credited in discovering Tenite and saying, hey, we could use this on helmets. And when the two realized how much head protection this could really provide and how much different it was than anything else, well, they knew they had something special on their hands. Because helmets at the time were made out of leather that maybe had some fiber reinforcement, but it was still soft, it was flexible, and he thought maybe instead of this soft, flexible leather, it could have a hard plastic shell, and he could borrow that webbed suspension design that came into the game from the Zupke helmet design and put that inside this plastic shell. So what you got was a custom molded hard shell helmet with the suspension underneath that was able to absorb impact, but also it's hard. It's not going to flex in every time you hit somebody. And because it's a suspension system, there's airflow, so it's a little bit cooler for players, on top of being lighter on players' heads. And even if you're running a school, you're a school administrator, or you're a coach, there's benefits on top of your players being more protected or being able to play a little bit more fearlessly or be able to deliver more vicious tackles because they now have a hard shell on their head. See, leather helmets, as great as they were and as advanced as they were, they still wore down really easily. They needed regular maintenance. A lot of times they needed to be maintained or repaired after every single game. They always got wet from sweat or rain or mud or all of the above, which made them heavier and grosser. They were susceptible to mold and mildew and deterioration, and every offseason, teams would have to send off their helmets to be reconditioned if they could afford it. And sometimes those helmets wouldn't be reconditioned and shipped back in time to start the year. A situation that's very similar to having an incompetent cobbler. And Riddell knows how to bypass incompetent cobblers and now incompetent head harness cobbler guys. So, in a number of different ways, the plastic helmet was going to be enticing to a lot of people, whether it was for gameplay or just cost effectiveness. And so with the invention of this helmet, the Riddell Company that had made a good fortune off of the design of shoes and cleats was now about to have an invention that would really change the game forever. And not just the game of football, but also it would end up going to war and be a substantial factor on the front lines of victory. But not right away. The helmet was going to have to do what everybody does when they try to break into the game on the big stage. Prove your worth. And the helmet wasn't really going to have a fantastic debut. It was going to need to be revised. The chemicals and chemistry were going to have to be perfected. Some alterations were going to have to be made. But heck, in 1938, Riddell didn't even know if this helmet was going to catch on at all. But if he was going to take it to the market, there was one guy he knew he had to talk to. If you want to head into Chicago from Evanston, Illinois, where Riddell resides, well, you would head down Lakeshore Drive. Now drive a little bit south from Evanston on Lakeshore Drive, hang a right on Addison, and in a few blocks you'll arrive at Wrigley Field. At this time, that was the home of the Chicago Bears that was owned and managed by a guy named George Halas. George Halas, nicknamed Papa Bear, was a player for the Chicago Bears, but he also was a coach for the Bears, owner of the Bears, and one of the founding members of the National Football League. And he was quite the innovator, both on the field and off the field. This is a guy that came up with daily practices for his professional players. He was covering the field in a tarp before most teams were. He was looking at game footage of other teams before other teams were, so he could figure out what they were doing and how to strategize against it. He was one of the first teams to come up with a team newspaper and one of the first teams to start doing their own local radio broadcasts. KDKA Radio in Pittsburgh had started to broadcast games, but it was Halas who decided, Our own team can broadcast our own games, and that way we can control our own narrative with our own broadcasters. He won so many games as a head coach over his multi-decade career, 324, that he held the record for most wins in the NFL until 1993 when he was passed by Don Shula. But he held on to that number 2 spot until the same year this is being recorded, 2022, when Bill Belichick finally crossed that 324 threshold. And now Belichick looks like he might be on his way to surpass Don Shula as well, who sits in the number 1 spot with 347. George Halas was pretty good at what he did. He was always looking for a competitive advantage, and he found it in a number of different ways, both on the field and with pieces of gear. And that's why we're talking about him here. He's an 8-time NFL champion, and the NFL itself and those championships may not have existed if not for his former head coach at the University of Illinois, Robert Zuppke. Halas has pointed to a moment in 1917 that we talked about last episode, a speech that Robert Zuppke, coach of Illinois, gave to his graduating players in 1917. It goes like this, quote, "Why is it that just when you players are beginning to know something about football after 3 years, I lose you, and you stop playing? It makes no sense. Football is the only sport that ends a man's career when it should just be beginning." End quote. And in Halas's autobiography, he said of this speech, quote, "His words were to govern the rest of my life." End quote. And that's because these words were an inspiration for creating a professional football league. Just the lamenting of the fact that these guys that were finally coming into their prime, finally filling out into frame, and finally developing some really good football IQ, they were no longer able to play. They were at the peak of their game, and as a punishment for being at the peak of your game, your career gets cut off. Because there were variations of pro leagues, but no National Football League. George Halas, among many things in football, was about to change all of that. And last episode, we talked about the origins of college football and the growth of the rules, the teams, the committees, but we didn't really dive into the NFL itself. And to do that, I'd like to bring in somebody that knows quite a bit more about the history of professional football than I do. This guy.
My name is Ken Crippen. I'm the founder and lead instructor at the Football Learning Academy. It's an online school that teaches pro football history, and so we like to cover all aspects of pro football history from the very beginning up till current day.
And so where does George Halas come into play during the early years of the NFL?
He was there at the very beginning. So it started as the Decatur Staleys. They're now known as the Chicago Bears. But George Halas was one of the driving forces behind the creation of the NFL. Him and Ralph Hay and several other people. They got together and formed what is now the NFL. They were meeting at a car dealership in Canton, Ohio, in August. Originally, just 4 teams from the Ohio area, because Ohio was the strongest. Originally, it was Western Pennsylvania that moved over into Ohio in the 1910s. As far as having the strongest teams, well, you would have teams from different states coming in and stealing players away in order to strengthen their teams. Then you would also have players jumping from team to team, sometimes within the same week. They'd play for 2 teams in the same week. Obviously, that was going to be a problem with injuries and things like that. Then also, you had issues as far as teams trying to steal college players who still had eligibility to play college, and that obviously upset the colleges, and they didn't want to see that. So they saw a need to put together a league to try to quell some of these issues that they were facing that I just brought up. And so that's when they got together in August to talk about it. They met again in September, and that's when they brought in more of those teams from those neighboring states, because they knew that those teams would still try to take the best players unless they were part of this organization. So they brought in teams from New York and Indiana, Illinois, stuff like that, in order to make sure that they had agreement among all of the strongest teams. And that September meeting is when they officially formed what is now the NFL.
In this shady but kind of funny way that players were hopping around from team to team or league to league, using pseudonyms, different masks, and all sorts of player poaching that was going on, wasn't exactly good for the reputation of the NFL. In fact, a lot of university coaches were trying to guide their players away from choosing a professional contract, including Halas's former coach, Robert Zupke. Zupke is on record even warning a player of his named Red Grange about the NFL and about the shady practices, saying it's better to stay here and get your education. But Grange would be lured away from the University of Illinois before his senior year, actually before his junior year had even ended. But it's a good thing for Grange that his jersey was already retired before the end of that season. He moved on and went to play for Halas and the Bears, and that caused a huge rift between George Halas and his basically mentor, Robert Zupke, and his alumni, the University of Illinois. Halas would try to make it up to Zupke by proposing a rule change in the NFL in 1926 that teams could not sign a college player until said player had graduated. Though that rule has been revised and altered over the years, it's still in place today. And Grange wouldn't be the only thing that Halas would borrow from Illinois. The colors of the Chicago Bears, that dark blue and orange, well, think about the Illini colors. It's blue and orange. All Halas did was darken that blue just a little bit. He also borrowed most of the strategies from his former coach, Robert Zupke. One would think with this much borrowing from college into pro, and especially with the whole Grange situation, that Halas maybe was maliciously doing this from Zupke, but no, that's not the case. It seems to be coming from a place of respect and admiration. Look, Zupke was quite the innovator with the helmet and with the formations, and in fact, Halas has the distinct honor of kind of a Roadrunner Coyote situation between he and Zupke when Zupke had his own invention blow up in his face, so to speak. Halas was trying to practice with a broken leg, and Zupke didn't realize his leg was broken and told him to quit slacking off, get in there and block somebody. And Halas became so angry he took off his helmet and threw it at his coach, who then kicked him out of practice. Halas went and found out that his leg was broken and had to sit out the whole season, but that meant he got to really watch from the sidelines how Zupke went about business. Halas has said in an autobiography, and it is quoted in a book called Papa Bear, that, quote, he was a tremendous coach. He was a careful teacher. He knew how to get the best out of young men. He was an innovator, end quote. And so this time is really pivotal for Halas because he saw that innovation. Zupke had invented a helmet that helped his team and helped protect players, but was also inventing plays and formations that made his team even better and won titles and championships. This entire business model, top to bottom, would shape how Halas would go about doing things with the NFL and the Chicago Bears. And to think that without Zupke, none of this probably would have happened. We probably wouldn't have the Chicago Bears that we know or the NFL that we know. That speech from Zupke is what made the difference. Halas could have gone on to have a tremendous career as a professional baseball player. He played with the New York Yankees for 12 games, won a national championship with Illinois with an incredible batting average, but Halas would end up getting hurt in that regard, leave the Yankees organization, and in his position after some guy named Vic would be some guy named Ruth that would take over for the Yankees. So just know that Halas really borrowed from Zupke because of how good it was and how much he respected his former coach. And you can really see that when you compare legacies side by side. Halas invented the NFL, the All-Star Game, the coach in the press box, looking at game film, covering the field with a tarp, daily practices, even worked to keep the existence of a plastic helmet in place in the league, among so many other inventions both on the field and off the field. And Zupke was the same way. Invented the Zupke helmet, invented the I formation, the huddle, the flea flicker, the flying trapeze. These two guys knew how to innovate, and they knew how important it was in the game. Not just coming up with strategy, not just enabling players, but coming up with tools and gear that makes a difference in the game as well. Last episode, we talked about how the Zupke helmet enabled a team of inexperienced players to do better while using Zupke's I formation. Well, as the I formation caught on and did better and better, he started doing variations of the T formation, and that is what Halas wanted to borrow. Halas would even hire Coach Ralph Jones away from the University of Illinois to help implement this version of the T formation. And for a while, the T formation worked to a T. Sorry, I had to use that pun. It was teed up for me. Yeah! In 1932, Ralph Jones used that T formation to coach the Bears to a 7-1-6 record. They were named NFL champions that year. In 1933, they won the NFL championship over the Giants 23-21. Jones was gone, Halas was back at the helm, and in 1934, they lost the championship game to the Giants. In spite of having a 13-0 record, They lost that game to the Giants because of shoes. That's right, gear had an influence on the game in 1934. When they played the Giants at the Polo Grounds in New York, well, that field was so frozen solid that the cleats they were wearing couldn't penetrate the ground. They were slipping and sliding all over the place. One of the Giants players during the warm-ups told the equipment manager, "Hey, I've played in a situation like this before, and we actually used basketball sneakers to get a better grip on the ground, believe it or not." Well, the Giants rushed out and went to a local gym, got some sneakers, and by the second half, they were wearing them, and that powered them to a 30-13 victory, and the Bears lost. And that game is still known to this day as the sneakers game, and it will be a future episode of how gear changed the game. But after that 1934 season, Red Grange retired. The Bears were trying to gain a little bit of traction and stay as good as they once were, even without their star quarterback. But was it really catching on? Was the popularity of the NFL that was gained by Grange going to last and stick around? It's tough to gain fans and keep fans over college football at the time, because college football teams not only had already decades of a head start, but had a built-in fan network of alumni and current students. Well, the NFL was maybe at a little bit of a crossroads at 15 years young in 1935, and the Bears, well, they were struggling to even beat rivals like the Green Bay Packers. They had lost the season opener to the Packers, and on October 27th, 1935, they lost a heartbreaker at home against the Packers by a score of 17-14. And with Halas sitting there taking in the pain of that loss, he may have been thinking, it's time for me to look for yet another advantage. And little did he know that the advantage was about to fall right into his lap, because that advantage was looking at him from across the stadium. Not in a creepy way, more like in a, oh man, I know that feeling kind of way. The guy that was looking at Halas from across the stadium was Clark Shaughnessy. Shaughnessy was in a weird bind of himself at his head coaching job at the University of Chicago, but he was quoted years after this chance encounter as saying, quote, "I made up my mind right then that I was going to try and help him," end quote. And so this is the part when I tell you about a guy named Clark Shaughnessy, right after a quick break. Clark Shaughnessy arrived in Chicago in 1933, taking over as head coach of the University of Chicago Maroons after Amos Alonzo Stagg. Big shoes to fill. But this was the job he hoped would lead him to a big goal that had been eluding him, the Rose Bowl. He'd gotten an invitation to the Rose Bowl back in 1925 when his Tulane Green Wave had a 9-0-1 season. But that invitation was declined by the officials of Tulane because they thought Washington was too big and too skilled and would just embarrass that Tulane football team. Imagine having an undefeated season and being told by your own school, "We don't think you can win." That probably didn't sit well with Shaughnessy because a couple years later, he left Tulane for their rival, Loyola, just across the town, known at the time as Loyola of the South. And he thought maybe that was his way to the Rose Bowl, but it was clear the program was declining year after year and through no fault of his own. So when the opportunity at the University of Chicago opened up, a respectable education institution in its own right, but also where Amos Alonzo Stagg innovated football. That was a guy who played with Walter Camp himself at Yale, who inspired Robert Zupke to do what he did with the I formation and variations of the T. And now, it was going to be Shaughnessy's turn. And on the same day he was moving into his office that once belonged to Stagg, the athletic director, T. Nelson Metcalf, walked into the room and brought up some things that didn't come up in Shaughnessy's job interview, like the fact that the president of the school, Dr. Robert Maynard Hutchins, hated football. Like, really hated football. In fact, this guy was probably the reason why Stagg was forced out in the first place. Now, T. Nelson Metcalf, the athletic director, it was his first year too, so I don't think he was thrilled. But either way, Shaughnessy was in quite the pinch because, as Metcalf was about to explain to Shaughnessy, the president of the school, Dr. Hutchins, was about to raise the bar on the educational standards of his players. They were going to have to study more. They were going to have to get better grades. They were going to have to put in way more time in the classroom than they were on the football field. And they were also going to have to now ace their end-of-term exams that happened in the spring, which meant that Shaughnessy could not practice as much as he wanted to, couldn't get his players studying football as much as he wanted to, and the spring practices that were so crucial in him instituting these big, grand ideas, these complicated plays, the keys to his success, which was finesse over strength and power, well, now he wasn't going to get to teach those in spring practice at all. Those were completely out the window. And when the bar is raised on the educational standards, when players aren't allowed to play as much or even practice at all in the spring or learn their own playbook, well, it's really hard to recruit good players when there's those kinds of restrictions on the line. So you can imagine that the program really started to go south, and it would regardless of how good the coach in charge was. And Shaughnessy had a lot more free time, which was probably frustrating to him, but at least with this free time, he could spend more time on his hobbies, which unfortunately was football, but another hobby was studying war tactics and battle tactics. If that sounds familiar, it's because we kind of touched on it last episode with the coach of Harvard named Loren Dellin. He invented the flying wedge, which was adapted from the tactics of Napoleonic War. Shaughnessy's love and interest of battle and war tactics is mentioned in a lot of books, including the one I have in my hand here, Papa Bear, The Life and Legacy of George Halas, by Jeff Davis. Quote, Shaughnessy was a student of warfare and the movement of troops and units. He was a theorist, seeking ways to transfer warfare to football. He kept his eye on Europe for possible ways to make his concepts fit to a T. For years, Shaughnessy had studied the tactics of one of his favorite military men, German Panzer General Heinz Gerdau. In a 1986 article for the Smithsonian Magazine, the late William Barry Furlong wrote that Shaughnessy considered football of the 1920s and 1930s a strategic reprise of World War I. That is to say, the offense was slow, ponderous, mindless, and usually ineffectual. End quote. And as we talked about at the top of the episode, there is a big difference between the tactics of World War I and the weapons of World War I and World War II. And it was Shaughnessy, the study of war tactics, that was seeing the advancements being made on the battlefield, not only with the weapons of war, but the tactics that had to change to adapt to those new weapons of war, put those weapons of war to good use. And it was this type of mindset, coupled with this interest that he had, that would bring football into the new age. But it almost didn't happen because he's not getting to put it to use at the University of Chicago as he's being hampered more and more every single year with players who aren't good. He's having to teach basics in his practice. Instead of teaching the T formation or how to run a wide out, he's having to teach how to punt the ball, how to throw a spiral, how to tackle. Yeah, you can imagine a smart guy like that was probably unfulfilled. And when you're a brilliant mind with brilliant ideas that are going unfulfilled, not that I know what being brilliant is like, you start to look elsewhere. And so Shaughnessy started hanging around Bears games, and when the Bears started to go downhill after Red Grange retired, that's when Shaughnessy thought maybe I could step in. That moment when Shaughnessy decided to approach Halas came after the Bears' second loss to the Green Bay Packers in the same season. And Shaughnessy, a couple weeks later, would see Halas at a civic dinner, chase him down and say, hey, I think you're running the T, but I've got some ideas that'll really make it work. Here, let me show you. And he started drawing on cocktail napkins, on the tablecloth, just to get his point across. And Halas was very intrigued. The two started hanging out and dissecting film because Halas had started obtaining game footage so that they could dissect plays and plan ahead. And this ended up being a perfect match because Halas, being an understudy of Zupke all those years ago before the beginning of the NFL, knew what it was like to try and come up with great strategies to get the most out of your players and to throw your opponents off. And Shaughnessy was all about that. And so Shaughnessy ends up getting a side hustle as he's hired as an advisor for the Chicago Bears. What a gig, and what a way to fulfill all these ideas that you have when it's going to literal crap at your day job at the University of Chicago. Shaughnessy joined a brain trust that included not only Halas, but a guy named Ralph Jones, who was recruited from the University of Illinois after coaching under Robert Zupke, as well as a guy named Luke Johnsos. In 1937, a couple of big and interesting things happened with the Chicago Bears and innovation. Number one was Luke Johnsos. Now, Shaughnessy was writing up all these brilliant ideas when it came to the T, and they were all dissecting what the enemy was doing by looking at game film, but it's hard to spot what they're doing when you're down on the sidelines at field level. You don't have that same overhead view or that same vantage point that the cameras had. So Johnsos said, why don't I go up to the upper level? Why don't I go up to the press box? I'll run down messages to you telling you what the other team is doing because I can see it better from that higher vantage point. And then I'll flip through the playbook and give you a play to run that'll counter that. And to start, it worked pretty well, even though it was kind of primitive. Some kid, this poor kid, was having to run up and down the stairs, having to run through crowds, hop over a wall, get to the sideline, and do it as fast as he could. And obviously, you could probably tell if you were in that situation, it would wear you down pretty quick. So they started putting messages in cleats and dropping them down from the balcony to the kid who would only have to run through half a section to get to the sideline. And that worked until a game in New York against the Brooklyn Dodgers when the Dodgers fans created a distraction as the shoe was being dropped and snatched it before the kid could even see where it went. And so Halas didn't give up on the plan. He said, you know what, this is working, screw it, let's install phone lines. And so they had a phone line installed in the press box that went straight to the sideline, and they could be in constant communication without any delay of carrier pigeons, kids, or cleats. And that is the origin of what we now know as coordinators up in the press box wearing headsets and communicating with coaches on the sidelines who were wearing their headsets. Yep, that started right here in 1937 with George Halas, Clark Shaughnessy, Luke Johnsos, and the Chicago Bears. And look, Shaughnessy's time at the University of Chicago, even though he wasn't getting to try out any of his own ideas with his own team, wasn't a complete waste. In 1937, he had some scholars there translate a book for him. A book by a guy that he really respected and had a lot of interest in. A guy named Heinz Guderian. He was a general with the German army in charge of the Panzers. And Panzers were the German tanks. Again, I'll read to you from the book Papa Bear, The Life and Legacy of George Halas. Quote, for years, Shaughnessy had studied the tactics of one of his favorite military men, German Panzer General Heinz Guderian. When Shaughnessy had friends on the University of Chicago faculty translate Guderian's first book on panzer tactics, he found his football soulmate. Guderian's ideas, in brief, called for using of movement to spread the defense thin and then attack swiftly at a weak point. End quote. Shaughnessy's study of these tactics by Guderian, the panzer tanks, the spreading thin of the enemy, these new and advanced tactics that adapted to new and advanced tools of war like the panzer tanks, was going to bring the T and football itself to the next level. He saw it all in his mind. He could diagram a football play just as well as he could diagram the way a battle unfolded. So you're looking at key things here that made the T a success that he would adapt here. Spreading thin of the defense, finding a weakness in the line because you spread the defense thin, using movement, and then punching through that weak point. And thanks to the tank, these tactics in battle were successful. When you have something strong, powerful like a tank, instead of just infantry and cavalry, you can punch through that enemy line so much easier. And it makes movement a little bit easier too. And it makes it so much easier to spread thin as opposed to being bunched together because a tank provides so much power. The translation of this book really opened up a lot of plays when it came to the T. Shaughnessy was bringing all kinds of plays to Halas and the Bears and saying, well, I've seen this tactic and this might work. Let's try this out and let's try that out. And the other advisors like Jones and Johnsos would improve upon that. So with the T really starting to work in 1937 and 1938, it was still missing that key factor. And that key factor would be a guy that they were watching in game films in 1938, a tailback at Columbia named Sid Luckman. Luckman was a really skilled athlete, but what stood out to Shaughnessy was that he was a really accurate passer, confident, would hang out, look at his options, and make the right play, and a nice, clean, crisp pass. Problem was, Luckman was so good at all these other categories, like dodging players and running the ball, that he probably wasn't going to fall to the number 6 pick in the draft. And so the Bears rushed out to not Columbia, but Pittsburgh, and convinced the owner of the Pittsburgh Pirates to trade Luckman after they drafted him in that number 2 slot on December of 1938. And that's how Sid Luckman became a Chicago Bear and how the T formation entered the modern era. And as we enter this 1939 football year, it would be a terrible one for Clark Shaughnessy. And kind of a good one too, but also kind of terrible as well. His training camp with the University of Chicago Maroons football team started out the way it had the past couple of years, with a bunch of people who really suck at football. Learning the basics, running basic drills, and watching them suck at those basic drills because they suck at football. because he can't recruit good players. And he can't make good players because they're not allowed to spend too much time on the football field. They have to go and do their studies. But luckily for Shaughnessy, his side job of being an advisor for the Chicago Bears gave him that intellectual fulfillment that he was looking for when it came to strategies and football. And even better, in 1939, first day of training camp, he's got a great player on his hands. This Sid Luckman guy, who would go on to win 4 NFL championships as a player, 1 as a coach, and is to this day considered one of the greatest NFL players of all time. Yeah, that guy. Well, on the first day of training camp, Shaughnessy is showing Sid Luckman the T formation, how he wants it to work. Spread the enemy thin, punch through the line. And this very talented, much sought-after rookie named Sid Luckman saw this play and said to Shaughnessy, quote, "You're nuts. How can you send a halfback into the line alone without a back to block for him? You'll get him killed." Shaughnessy replied, quote, "You worry about the signals, we'll worry about the halfbacks," end quote. So there was some skepticism about this T formation and how it was going to work and the danger of just punching through the line without somebody blocking for you. How is that even possible in today's game? Today being 1939. The T formation was hitting its peak with the military strategies being put into practice on the football field, on top of having Sid Luckman and Luke Johnsos up in the press box doing advising from up there. They couldn't beat the Packers that 1939 season, but they did manage to finish with an 8-3 record, and that is a night and day difference compared to what was going on across town when Shaughnessy was still having to fulfill his duties as head coach of the Chicago Maroons. This college football program at Chicago was a Big Ten school, a respected program in 1933 when Shaughnessy arrived, but through, well, let's call it institutional restrictions, every season progressively got worse and worse. And this year was just painful to watch. They couldn't keep up with the Big Ten. They could hardly keep up with anybody. They did manage to get 2 wins out of their 8 games for a 2-6 record, but in the 6 games that they lost, they didn't even put up a touchdown. And these weren't just losses, and these weren't just embarrassing shutout losses. We're talking really embarrassing scores. The game against Harvard, they lost 61-0. Against Michigan, they lost 85-0. Against Virginia, 47-0. Ohio State, 61-0. And Illinois, 46-0. They weren't just losing, they were getting run over and embarrassed. And that is exactly what the president of the school, Dr. Robert Maynard Hutchins, had in mind all along. He wanted this team to look that bad. Could it get much worse than this? And toward the end of the football season of 1939, Chicago wasn't the only one that was having an embarrassing year. The Stanford Indians, they were called the Indians at the time, they are no longer, were being coached by a guy named Tiny Thornhill, because back then, football players and coaches had a funny little name before their last name, like Tiny Thornhill. And this Stanford team was going into their last game of the season on December 5th against Dartmouth, eyeing a perfect record. Perfect being a fully defeated season. The opposite of an undefeated season. They had yet to win a game that year. And going into the half against Dartmouth, it was looking like this was going to be the case. They were down by a score of 0-3. And Tiny Thornhill was trying to pep the team up by saying, "You got to go out there and you got to give them the old skip skidoo." That's how I imagine a guy named Tiny Thornhill would talk, but that's not a real quote. But let me give you a real quote, because Tiny Thornhill knew that he wasn't going to get his players to skip skidoo their way to victory, so he brought in some inspiration. A member of the champion 1933 Stanford team, a guy named Bones Hamilton. Surely he could say something that would make these guys rise up and rise to the occasion. And so Bones Hamilton steps up and says the following, and I quote, "You are by far and large the worst group of players who have ever worn the Stanford red." End quote. Well, clearly Stanford is a team of masochists because they went out in the second half, scored 2 unanswered touchdowns, and won the game 14-3. So they ended up with a record of 1-7-1. Surely this would turn things around. Surely this would keep Tiny Thornhill his job as coach of Stanford. Nope. He was fired. And with that, there was a vacancy at Stanford. But meanwhile, across the country, on the Tuesday before Christmas, the 1940 schedule for the Chicago Maroons would get posted. and that schedule would never get played. 2 days later, the Thursday before Christmas, Dr. Robert Maynard Hutchins would cancel and put an end to the football program at the University of Chicago. The team had gotten so bad, maybe by design, that it was a pretty easy thing for him to do. Because remember, Dr. Robert Maynard Hutchins at the University of Chicago hated football, really hated it. And he made that stance known after he canceled the football program by making the following public quote, "I did not de-emphasize football at the University of Chicago. I abolished it. There is no doubt that football has been a major handicap to education in the United States." End quote. Hutchins had hoped this move and his statements backing up this abolition would inspire other university presidents to follow suit, to abolish football, to prioritize education over football. But as you can see today, football is a financial pillar of the university system. The NCAA makes over $1 billion a year, and in 25 states, the highest paid government employee is a college football coach. Shaughnessy was offered a full-time job to be a teacher at the University of Chicago, would have made a comfortable living, and that would have been great because he could just teach during the day and still keep his side job with the Bears. But Shaughnessy packed up his things and walked away from Stagg Stadium, a stadium that had once housed innovations in football. The original monsters of Midway would now sit empty, quiet, and isolated. Shaughnessy, being a guy with a big interest in military technology, would be fascinated by what took place at his Stagg Stadium after he left. That big, quiet, isolated, and empty stadium turned out to be the perfect place to begin a top-secret military program. On December 2nd, 1942, in the basement of that stadium, unbeknownst to anyone around, the Manhattan Project would begin on an old racquetball court. Chicago Pile 1, as it was called, was the first ever man-made nuclear chain reaction, scientists experimenting with the harnessing of nuclear energy. While this experiment would lead to nuclear power and other things, it would also lead to the culmination of the Manhattan Project, the atom bomb. If only Shaughnessy knew. But all he cared about after getting fired was the fact that he probably only had one last shot as a head coach. He wanted to go somewhere where he could put his brilliant ideas to use, where he could get himself to a Rose Bowl. So he headed to a coaching conference and ended up at, Stanford. That's why I brought up that story of Stanford. There was a vacancy at Stanford. He took it. And Stanford fans who were sick of losing with Tiny Thornhill weren't exactly excited about the prospect of Clark Shaughnessy coming in. Being the head coach of the University of Chicago, of course, he's taking blame for the end of that football program. I mean, they have multiple terrible seasons leading up to that program being abolished. And Loyola of the South, I didn't mention this, in 1939, the team that Shaughnessy also coached for before he went to the University of Chicago. Loyola of the South also ended their football program in 1939. So, as you can imagine, fans saw Shaughnessy as a program killer, and now he was coming to their school. Prescott Sullivan of the San Francisco Examiner said, quote, "We have heard it said that Shaughnessy has developed the knack of losing to a point where, with him, it is an exact science. In light of his record, we aren't at all surprised at this." End quote. So Shaughnessy had big shoes to fill when he went to the University of Chicago because he was taking over for the legendary coach Amos Alonzo Stagg, and that would sort of also be the case at Stanford. Tiny Thornhill didn't have big shoes to fill, but the Stanford coach before him sure did. That coach was Pop Warner. He coached Stanford from 1924 to 1932 and had a .781 winning percentage and appeared in 3 Rose Bowls. Warner was also the coach at the Carlisle Indian School during their legendary run at beating Ivy League schools with his passing game and incredibly talented quarterback Jim Thorpe. Pop Warner's name is now also synonymous with youth football. In the winter of 1940, shortly after Shaughnessy was announced as the new head coach of Stanford, he announced publicly that he was going to turn this system around and this team around using his T formation. The March 8, 1940 edition of the Fresno Bee announced in the headline, "Stanford coach will scrap Warner system," meaning that Shaughnessy was going to toss out the system they'd been using for years ever since Pop Warner was the coach, the Pop Warner system. And people who missed the days of success under head coach Pop Warner were really skeptical about that too. It only drew him even more criticism. So Shaughnessy was taking a lot of heat. Everyone was skeptical, everybody was critical before he'd even coached a game at Stanford. So when Pop Warner himself was asked about Stanford's new coach and his new strategy, surely some nice words from one of the most respected coaches in the game would help this guy out. But nah, Warner piled on with everybody else and stated with disdain, quote, "If Stanford wins a single game with that crazy formation, you can throw all the football I ever knew into the Pacific Ocean," end quote. Thanks, Pop. And so how did the Stanford players feel? Well, we found out during that pep talk by Bones Hamilton that they are masochists. In a book called The Wow Boys, A Coach, a Team, and a Turning Point in College Football by James W. Johnson, Milt Mucinich is quoted as saying, "We'd been reading about all those beatings Shaughnessy's men had been taking, so we were joking it wasn't like Stanford to hire somebody like this to coach us. We felt the new coach is what we deserved," end quote. That's masochist thinking. This coach who's getting the crap kicked out of his guys is now going to come there and they were going to get the crap kicked out of them. As the 1940 season was set to begin, it was a win-win for Shaughnessy and Halas. Shaughnessy would keep his relationship and his advisorship with the Chicago Bears, but now Shaughnessy had a team that he could try out his ideas with and bounce ideas back and forth with the Bears and with his new Stanford team. Things were only going to get better in this regard. And Shaughnessy saw this as another chance to get that thing he'd always wanted, a Rose Bowl. And according to that book, The Wow Boys, A Coach, a Team, a Turning Point in College Football, Shaughnessy walked in on that first day of practice and started drawing up a play on the board and said, "This is the play that is going to get you to the Rose Bowl." And he was drawing up the T formation. And when he drew up that modern T formation, you can imagine the players' minds were blown, right? They couldn't believe it. They were amazed and saw their ticket to the Rose Bowl too. Nope, they laughed at him. Junior Frankie Alberts said, quote, "The guy sounded like a goof. I didn't know whether to laugh or walk out." And that was told in that book that I've referenced already. Also in the book said, quote, "The diagram showed a back hitting a hole in the line in a direct handoff from the quarterback." And Albert said, quote, "Whoever heard of a back charging into a line without a blocker ahead of them? It sounded like suicide," end quote. Sounds really similar to exactly what Sid Luckman said the year before. But when you're running a T formation, nobody blocking, you're taking these big risks, basically doing what a tank is meant to do among infantry units, and apply that to college students instead of big grown professional football players on the Chicago Bears. Well, it's a much riskier play. It's a much more dangerous play. But luckily for Shaughnessy, he was there in 1939 when the plastic helmet made its debut, and he saw the potential for that helmet. A hard, rigid, armored tool for battle. Now, players both on the Bears and on the Stanford team had called this T formation and punching through the line suicide, and you'll get somebody killed without a blocker. Now, I should mention in 1939, the NCAA made helmets mandatory for all players. So going into 1940, every single player on the field is going to be wearing a helmet. But only a couple of teams in football were going to take to the field in 1940 wearing a plastic helmet. Now, if you're going to have players execute tactics that are meant for tanks, you need to kind of at least try and get them armored similar to tanks. Otherwise, those critical players I just mentioned are going to be right. It's suicidal. Think about the football gear of the day. That gear was meant for a different style of play, the single wing offense, because that's just masses of players pushing the ball forward. But this T formation's different. It's got busy backfields, men in motion, spreading lines thin, charging backs at the line without blockers. It's high risk, high reward, but high danger for injury too. So that same old leather protection wasn't going to cut it. And Shaughnessy's a smart guy. He knew this, and he definitely knew this after he saw the plastic helmet in action at that All-Star game in 1939. But I want to take you back to that article in the Fresno Bee from March 8th, 1940. When he's talking about the T formation, he's quoted as saying this, quote, "Players make my system. If the boys are big and rough and adapted to power plays, this is what they will get. If power is beyond their strength, I'll give them something they can handle. Material is important, but also how you use it." End quote. And giving them something to handle could mean writing up different plays, but also material being important, well, it might be the material in the playbook, and it might be the material that is underneath their jerseys. Talking about pads. Journalist Beecher Kellogg of San Francisco wrote in an article in 1940 about this phase of outfitting players so that they were capable of the power of the T. And it goes like this, quote, "Yet for all the hustle and deep concentration, Shaughnessy still has time for the small details. For weeks, he planned a color combination for the game uniforms. He even sat at the rim of the stadium while a player wearing different suits put on a dress rehearsal on the floor of the Big Bowl. Shaughnessy was trying to get a spectator's angle on the uniforms. Finally, he sent the gritters out in white helmets, red jerseys, and white pants. The suits were a sensation of the coast. Underneath the suits, the players wore the finest, lightest, and most protective set of pads ever given to the Stanford men." End quote. And so you know where I'm going with this, right? We've already talked about Riddell and Halas and this brain trust that's going on and the connections to the plastic helmet that happened at that All-Star game. In reading the book Wow Boys, A Coach, a Team, a Turning Point in Football by James W. Johnson, it does say this, quote, "When the Indians trotted onto the field, they were resplendent in their new uniforms, white pants, red jerseys, and white plastic helmets." End quote. And okay, this is where I have to, let's say, open up the window of the fourth wall and ask you to peer inside real quick. When I read this quote, it was clear to me, all right, Stanford used plastic helmets in 1940, one of the first teams to do so. But when I'm looking through the newspaper clippings and seeing pictures from all of their game days, the helmets don't look like the Riddell helmets that I'd seen in ads during 1940. They look a little bit different. So I started cross-referencing and wondering, did this somehow get wrong? But the helmets they were wearing did look different. They didn't look like the traditional models of Spalding or McGregor in their fiber-reinforced helmets. I couldn't figure out what these things were. And I want to get things right. I want to get the facts straight and make sure we get this done right instead of just saying, well, this one source says it and that's good enough for me. If I see something that contradicts, I'm going to try and get to the bottom of it. That's the whole fun of listening to this show, right? So this took me on a multi-day detour of research. It's hard to make out in detail what the helmets exactly look like because it's old scanned shots of old newspapers, but it is clear to me that these aren't the standard leather helmets that everybody else was using. And I'm combing through literally thousands of newspapers, catalogs, and other sources just trying to match up what I'm seeing on quarterback Frankie Albert. It wasn't that McGregor 8-spoke reinforced model that basically half of football was using, and it wasn't the Spalding fiber-reinforced winged helmet that the other half of football was using. One newspaper spread even showed the preseason headshots of all the players wearing the same model of a helmet that I realized was clearly just a prop used for photo day because it wasn't what they were wearing in the games. I looked around so much that I started to go nuts. These helmets looked different. They weren't matching up with any standard models that I'd seen. I'd been looking on antiquefootball.com and matching it up with their charts that they have. I went to helmethistory.com, and that site does show a plastic helmet for Stanford in 1940, but other sites don't, and don't confirm anything at all. There's one website that's selling a leather replica of the Stanford helmet that is definitely not anything they were using in 1940, but that wasn't good enough for me to confirm anything. I need to know. One thing I do know is that Stanford isn't using leather helmets. I also know that Shaughnessy would want better than what those leather helmets of the day offered. But he also may have been reluctant to get the Riddell helmets because he saw them break in that All-Star game. Antiquefootball.com's helmet identification chart got me a little bit closer to the answer. I think they're most likely using a helmet that was indeed stronger and newer and more protective than any other helmet by any other team. It looks like it could have been a likely all fiber reinforced helmet because the other ones just had fiber reinforced sections, or it was a type of helmet that only existed for a short period of time, a molded rubber helmet. It was kind of a transitional thing between the fiber reinforced helmet and the plastic helmet. It only lasted a couple of years, just like, if you recall from last episode, the Curtis pneumatic helmet. And this would explain that glossy shine seen on game day photos that was shinier and glossier and smoother than the helmets of all of their opponents. But it doesn't look like a Spalding, it doesn't look like a McGregor, it doesn't look like the Riddell of the time, but it may be an early, maybe prototype model of the Wilson helmet. Either an all-fiber, rubber molded, possibly a Wilson helmet model F2020. Again, I want to be as accurate as possible. I'm trying to figure this stuff out. And the helmet that Frankie Albert is wearing in a lot of these pictures looks really similar to a plastic helmet made by Wilson in the 1950s. And Wilson would make sense because George Halas actually had a financial stake in Wilson in the 1940s and 1950s, even though he had ties also with the Riddell Company. But still, I'm going nuts trying to find some kind of source that does something. And back then, sports writers were selective in the details they provided, and a lot of times they didn't select anything about gear. Just when I was about to give up, just when I was about to really go nuts, my man, Bill Tobit of the Oakland Tribune, on Friday, September 13th, 1940, had a paragraph at the end of his column that went like this, quote, "It would be negligence if Stanford's entrance yesterday were noted without discussing the gorgeous costumes the boys will wear this fall. There may be something hopefully symbolic in it, purity and all that being ruling theme these days, but the boys are wearing white pants and white helmets. Uppers are crimson as usual. Not exactly a pure white, more on the eggshell tint. The pants, the ones wore yesterday and which will be used in practice, are a sort of latex woven material. Their game trousers were solid and will be thoroughly white of airplane cloth, unless of course the field is muddy. Those helmets are pips. Pips, by the way, is an old slang term. It means drop dead gorgeous or very best in class. The shell seems to be made of a molded rubber, as solid as a fountain pen shell. Maybe it's this newfangled plastic we're hearing so much about. The funny thing about them is having someone tap the outside with a pencil while you're inside. Sounds like a thunderclap, but opposing players don't go around tapping the enemy on the sconce with pencils." End quote. At last, there was something different about the helmets they took onto the field in 1940. Maybe it was molded rubber, but does rubber clap like the sound of thunder when tapped with a pencil? These helmets were different. They may not have been Riddell, they may have been Wilson, but either way, there you have it from Bill Tobit. These helmets were different. They were solid. Maybe they were plastic, maybe they were molded rubber, but they were stronger and more powerful than these leather helmets of the day. Brand new, strong, hard helmets that clap like thunder on top of the head. Shaughnessy's men were now as protected as panzers. So, in 1939, Stanford went 1-7-1. But 1940, new season, new coach, new helmets. But critics weren't expecting anything new. They'd already labeled the team as losers, Shaughnessy was a loser, and they projected Stanford would lose their season opener to San Francisco State. Well, the Stanford Indians won that game 27-0. Surely that'll silence the critics? No. They said, great, you beat San Francisco State, but the real test comes next week. Oregon. Stanford beat Oregon 13-0. In spite of allowing 0 points against in 2 games, journalists still were doubtful. Prior to Stanford's October 12th game against Santa Clara, they picked Santa Clara to win. But Stanford won 7-6. On October 19th, everybody picked Washington State to beat Stanford. That Washington State team was ranked number 10. Stanford won that game, 26-14. And but what about the rivalry game the following week, October 26th against number 9 ranked USC? Well, this one's an interesting one that I want to point out because there's an interesting thing that Shaughnessy does here. I've already gave you some context of how these stronger helmets are providing Shaughnessy with a bit of an advantage. Well, this October 26th game, Shaughnessy uses the helmet for yet another advantage. It's mentioned in the San Francisco Examiner sports section a few days later on October 30th of 1940 in Harry Borba's Sidelines column. It says, quote, "Clark D. Shaughnessy takes no chances. When he sends in an order to his field general, Frankie Albert, he means it to get there and be understandable. Because substitute players cannot talk with teammates until one play has elapsed, and because they sometimes get excited and forget after that one play, Shaughnessy writes his orders out. When Ken Robeski entered the game for the injured Chuck Taylor against the Trojans last Saturday, he carried the mail. It was in his helmet. After one play, Robeski ran back to Albert, pulled off his helmet, and gave him the diagram for a new attacking formation. Little Frankie read it as avidly as a college boy conning Esquire. Shaughnessy declares that Albert doesn't always follow instructions. Quote, I sent him a few terrible suggestions during the Trojan game, Shaughnessy says. Fortunately, Albert disregarded them. End quote of that. But the article goes on, Shaughnessy's method for communicating in foolproof fashion with his quarterbacks reminds us of the time that Herbert Fleischheimer Jr. broke into the Stanford lineup in a Trojan battle in 1927. Given his chance to replace Biff Hoffman, fullback Herbie grabbed his helmet, raced up to the referee who acknowledged lineup changes at the time and blurted out everything. Fleischheimer for Hoffman and let Freenup throw the passes. End quote. Clever guy, that Shaughnessy. These days, we have quarterbacks with headsets in their ears, and that would come along in the 1950s. We're going to talk about it in a future episode. But this was a way of diagramming plays through the helmet with no speaker, just writing them out. And I'm sure this wasn't the only game that Shaughnessy did that. But it is another way that a helmet is being used as an advantage. And who knows, a game-winning touchdown or a game-winning play may have come from one of these secret helmet diagrams. That win over USC made 5 wins in a row and a 5-0 record halfway through the season. November 2nd, they took on UCLA, who had a star player that went by the name of Jackie Robinson. Fast guy, great player. And Stanford won that game 20-14. And UCLA going into that game was ranked number 6. So here we are halfway through the season. They keep beating teams that are picked to beat them. Are the critics that were at the beginning of the year saying all these nasty things starting to change their tune a little bit? Well, Prescott Sullivan, who I quoted earlier, saying that Shaughnessy had losing down to a science, here's what he said in the November 9th, 1940 edition of the San Francisco Examiner. 6 in a row is big, but it's not 7. Very few thought they'd even win their first. Fewer thought they'd go roaring through the other 5. But they did. And then the article goes on a few sentences later. Our hunch is that Washington will beat Stanford. End quote. And this was the article leading into the Washington versus Stanford game. Washington was ranked number 6 because UCLA, who was number 6 the week before, lost that ranking because they lost to Stanford. So yeah, number 6 Washington, their home beat writer, Mr. Prescott Sullivan, picking Washington to win. Oh, look at that. He was wrong again. Stanford won that game 20-10. And with that win, Shaughnessy was now starting to enter the conversation about maybe getting to go to the Rose Bowl. But the big test was going to be the following week, November 16th, against Oregon State, who was ranked number 4. But before he could play that game, he had to go to an award ceremony at the San Francisco Advertising Club. Also in attendance that day, Prescott Sullivan, the naysayer journalist, who was also giving some public remarks. Sullivan gave some remarks, Shaughnessy was introduced, and when Shaughnessy took the podium, he said, quote, "Well done, Sullivan. Pick Oregon State to beat us next Saturday and we'll be in the Rose Bowl." That's an actual quote, and everybody had a good laugh. Yet Sullivan, the following week, picked Oregon State to beat Stanford. And Stanford won that game too, 24-14. Man, this team full of losers sure does suck at losing. They haven't even done it yet. But some critics still weren't convinced. What was going to convince them? Maybe beating their rival, California, who was ranked number 3 on their last game of the season, November 30th. Stanford won that game 13-7. A perfect season, a 9-0 record. A year before, their pep talk at halftime of their last game of the season involved a great player in Stanford history saying, "You guys are the worst group of players I've ever seen." And now we got an undefeated season from a coach that was called a loser that has losing down to a science and a team that had been written off by their own fans. Well, everybody changed their tune. Somebody check the Pacific Ocean, see if Pop Warner is out there throwing everything he ever knew about football into it. Nah, he changed his tune as well. At the end of the season, Warner was asked about the success at Stanford in this T formation, and he said, quote, "Shaughnessy has taken that T formation we used when I played at Cornell in 1892 and made it work as it has never worked before. This is because he added his own ideas. There is no mystery about Shaughnessy's success at Stanford, and I can see it. The only mystery is where the ball is on some of those tricky plays of his." End quote. That's high praise from a legendary member of the game. And he's talking about tricky plays like when the ball would be snapped to the quarterback would turn his back toward the line, so nobody could see where the ball was as they tried to attack it, and they could never see where he was going to send the ball next. So that's what Pop Warner thinks of this season in this T formation. Stanford had the perfect season. But it wouldn't be perfect for Shaughnessy unless he got the one thing he'd had his sights set on for almost 20 years at this point. The one thing he promised his players if they ran the T the right way. An invitation to the Rose Bowl. And he got it. As the dominant team in the Pacific, they were the host of the 1941 Rose Bowl. Last time Shaughnessy got a Rose Bowl invite, he was at Tulane, and the officials of that school declined that invitation. There would be no declining this time. Stanford would play Nebraska on New Year's Day, 1941, to complete their perfect season and to finally cement Shaughnessy's legacy. I gotta mention that while Shaughnessy was winning all of these games with Stanford, he was still putting a lot of time and work into being an advisor for the Chicago Bears. Stanford was kind of like a testing ground, a proving ground, an incubator for strategies there that he would then hand off to the Bears, say this is working, try this, adjust this, and Shaughnessy was looking at game film from the Bears games and doing some advising there. Well, the Bears were having a great season of their own. They beat their rivals, the Green Bay Packers, a couple of times and went on to have an 8-3 record. And the team was working really, really well. On top of the fact that the Bears had a very talented Sid Luckman. I mentioned that Chicago had an 8-3 season. They finished second in the league in total points scored with 238. The Washington Redskins totaled a league best 245. And that is who the Bears would be playing in the 1940 NFL Championship game. That Washington Football Club also had the best points differential in the NFL. That's points scored versus points allowed. And had the third least amount of points against. Of the Bears' 3 losses that year, one of them was to Washington, a game in which Chicago was held to just a field goal. If Halas and the Bears were going to win this game, it was going to take something special. And that something special revealed itself to Shaughnessy during his train ride from California to Chicago. So Shaughnessy's brilliant plays were all finally coming to fruition, and they would do so in the same year. I'll read to you again from Papa Bear, The Life and Legacy of George Halas by Jeff Davis. Quote, "On the Chicago-bound train, Shaughnessy pored over Guderian's latest triumph, the Nazis' astounding sweep through France. Germany launched its attack against France on May 10, 1940. The Allies went north, Furlong reminds us. Guderian's tanks punched a hole through the French defenses in the middle at Sedan and poured through, waiting for neither the infantry nor the supplies as they outflanked them. On May 15th, Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of England for less than a week, received a disparaging call from Paul Renault, Premier of France. 'We lost the battle,' cried Renault." End quote. And this book now draws up the parallels between what Guderian is doing and what the T formation does. Quote, "What Guderian had done was send a 29-division army group to the right, man in motion, thereby drawing the Allies to the left toward the North Sea, the sideline, to defend against the German power. Guderian dispatched a tank thrust, quick opener, and as the French line collapsed to cover, the German general swept left around the French flank and broke out on a dead run to Paris. Shaughnessy had a name for it, the fullback counter. That play and other misdirection calls were the finishing touches that had been missing from Halas's attack throughout the 1940 season. As soon as his train arrived on Monday, Shaughnessy hurried to the Bears' offices on the east end of the loop at 37 South Wabash to watch film with Halas. They rehashed every play of the defeat in Washington in fine detail." End quote. So how did his ideas do? Did it all work out? Well, the Bears beat the Washington Redskins in that championship game 73-0. 73-0. Dominant. Yeah, the guy's good, and he's smart. Shaughnessy didn't have time to hang around and celebrate with the Bears. He was a national champion, but he had one thing on his mind: getting to Pasadena and being in the Rose Bowl. And maybe Halas had some advice for Shaughnessy at this point, because George Halas was the MVP of the 1919 Rose Bowl game when his Great Lakes Naval Facility team took on another military base team in that Rose Bowl game. But Shaughnessy would be taking something else from the Bears along with him as an extra advantage. When Stanford took to that Rose Bowl field, they had a little bit of help from Luke Johnsos up in the press box on a direct phone line down to the sidelines. Stanford would beat Nebraska in that 1941 Rose Bowl by a score of 21-13. Clark Shaughnessy, a guy who everybody had doubted. Tulane didn't think he could win even after he had an undefeated season. Loyola of the South gave him less and less to work with until the program went into the ground, and we know how it went at the University of Chicago. If it hadn't been for George Halas, you wonder if that brilliance would have just gone to complete waste. So in the Bay Area, the critics finally started to change their tune. And across the country, well, this successful run informed everybody about this new modern version of the T and how it worked. Leading up to the Rose Bowl during December, there were a lot of articles that I saw in my research that explained the T formation, had drawn up diagrams right on the front page of the sports section, showing how it worked, showing the different playing styles, showing why it was successful. And if you learned anything last episode, it's that communication and transportation are key. Well, the communication is a key part here of Shaughnessy's success really taking off, because people were now finding out about the T formation and how it works and how successful it was. And because these articles were circulating all over the place, over 2 million people listened in to the radio broadcast of that Rose Bowl game. On the play-by-play call that day was Bill Stern, who called the Rose Bowl game for 10 years from 1939 to 1949. He took over from a guy who called the game in 1938 on play-by-play, a guy by the name of Ronald Reagan. You might be thinking, Ronald Reagan, the actor? Yeah, called play-by-play for the Rose Bowl. Isn't that nuts? This victory and great season for him got him a starring role in a motion picture about himself called The Spirit of Stanford. So that team of losers ends up having an undefeated season, a Rose Bowl victory. And this coach that was labeled as having losing down to an exact science just had an undefeated season, a historically decisive NFL championship victory, and his first trip to the Rose Bowl was a victory as well. A lot of factors came together at the right moment. Stanford players rose to the occasion and were very talented athletes, especially quarterback Frankie Albert, along with Komestevic and Stanley and a couple of others. Shaughnessy was a brilliant coach, but Shaughnessy wouldn't have even had that job if it weren't for George Halas. And let's go back to the connections of the three guys I talked about at the top: Shaughnessy, Halas, and Riddell. Those guys all ending up in each other's orbit had an influence on all three of those people, which influenced the outcomes of all of their interests. Multiple factors at play, but all coming together at the right time. And let's go back to John T. Riddell and his connections. His helmet was in action during that 1940 season. We know that for a fact. A player on Nebraska was even wearing a plastic helmet in the Rose Bowl and had been wearing one all season to protect a lingering head injury. And while we talked about Stanford, and I already went through the details on the helmets that they were wearing and how they most likely were plastic or a new type of hardened innovation, well, we do know that there was one team that was all wearing Riddell plastic helmets in 1940. And it was a team that had a connection to John Riddell, the Northwestern Wildcats. And that makes sense. Northwestern is in Evanston. John Riddell is from Evanston. In fact, John Riddell's high school team, as we learned, had to deal with the same terrible cobbler as the Northwestern Wildcats football team did. So there was probably a connection between the two when he started releasing his cleats, and he used that connection to get his plastic helmet to the market. Now, the Wildcats wouldn't be anybody else's first pick, probably. They'd had a losing season before. It was a 3-4-1 record, and Pappy Waldorf, even though he was a respected coach, he just didn't have a powerhouse program there at Northwestern. And prior to this 1940 season, sports writers were kind of mocking him a little bit because Waldorf had said, "I lost 18 lettermen, and 12 of those players were linemen." And so the, quote, loud cry, as many sports writers mocked, was that Northwestern has no line, has no blockers, and thus has no way to compete. So when you lose 12 linemen, 18 lettermen, and you have a bunch of new players coming in, how can you make them better? How do you strategize when you have no line and no blockers? How do you get the ball forward? How do you shut players down? Well, this new helmet was probably about to be a factor in helping remedy that problem. And while most newspapers and journalists were mocking Waldorf and Northwestern going into the season, Bob Ray, the writer of the column X-Ray in the Los Angeles Times, mentioned something else that nobody else was mentioning about the Northwestern team and what they were going to have going into the season. It was only a quick blurb mention, but on the day that Northwestern was opening their season, October 5th, 1940, Here's what the last little bit of the X-ray column that day had to say about this new type of helmet that nobody at T4 affects. Quote, Northwestern players are wearing glass-like helmets of Tenite, a lightweight, resilient plastic made by the Kodak film people. Maybe it'll help a fullback cut his way through a line for a first down. End quote. That was the full extent of the mention of use of plastic helmets outside of advertising in newspapers. Not much, huh? But Bob Ray in his X-ray column bring up something the helmet does provide, perhaps an advantage, saying that maybe it's going to help somebody cut through the line a little bit better. We just talked about Stanford and them having to cut through a line, punch through an enemy line without the use of a blocker. Players were calling it suicide. Now you have an inexperienced and undersized team. How are they going to successfully run plays? This brings up something we talked about last episode, compensatory behavior. The book Newton's Football by Alan St. John and Anicia Ramirez says, quote, a phenomenon called compensatory behavior explains why safety devices don't always work as their designers predict. The theory suggests that people have a preset tolerance for risk, and that if a safety device lowers the perceived risk, the individual will, perhaps subconsciously, modify his or her own behavior to reach that internal threshold. In other words, when some device makes you feel safe, you're more likely to behave recklessly. The brain outsources the job of protecting the body to the device, impairing good judgment. For example, drivers behind the wheel of a large SUV with four-wheel drive and airbags tend to drive faster and more aggressively on snowy roads than they would if they were driving a tiny old economy car. A football player with a helmet and a face mask feels well protected, perhaps even invincible, and will tackle in ways he wouldn't even consider with a bare head. End quote. So when you have players like on Stanford who are being told to run a T formation play without a blocker that they're calling suicide, and maybe the helmet and compensatory behavior is part of that, whether it's with Stanford or whether it's with a team that was considered to be inexperienced and undersized at Northwestern. On October 5th, the same day that X-ray article comes out in the Los Angeles Times about Northwestern and their plastic helmet, they opened their season against Syracuse and won 40-0. But the real test came the following week, October 12th, when they took on defending champion the Ohio State. And they held the Ohio State to only 6 rushing yards the entire game. Waldorf was named Coach of the Week by column writer Henry Supper of the United Press, and that article circulated in newspapers across the country. It started like this, quote, his publicized team was the worst of his career last year, so this season he hauled out the crying towels and the world wept with him, end quote. Because again, Waldorf wasn't that optimistic to start the season. Here's another quote from the article. High and mighty Ohio State champions of the Big Ten was rolling along and high figuring to win the title again. But last week, it went up against Northwestern, a team, according to Waldorf, that didn't have a chance. And Ohio State finished on the short end of a 6-3 score. End quote. They end up going on to beat Wisconsin, then Indiana, lost to number 4 Minnesota by a missed field goal, 13-12, beat Illinois the following week, took on number 6 Michigan. They did drop that game, but they ended the season with a hard one, going up against Notre Dame. And how did this inexperienced group do against one of the most legendary football programs of all time? Well, they won 20-0, of course. Not only was it a big deal for Northwestern to beat Notre Dame, they were kind of considered rivals at the time, but they handed Notre Dame one of their worst defeats in the 40-year history between those two teams. So prior to the season, Northwestern getting mocked for their terrible season the year before, Pappy Waldorf getting mocked for his crying towels and his oh woe is me attitude when it comes to the fact that he lost 18 lettermen, 12 of them linemen. He had an inexperienced and outmatched team going into the season that ended up doing really well in spite of being mocked, in spite of their inexperience. And they had some good coaching, they had some good athletes that rose to the occasion, and they had some good equipment to help them take on this monumental task. If it sounds like you've heard this story before, it's because in some form or another, we've covered the same story arc a few times already in the past 2 episodes of this podcast. The Riddell Company and others would use Northwestern's successful season and their use of the plastic helmet to drive the sales of those plastic helmets. Throughout the season, there was a blurb that was being sent out to all the newspapers, along with an image of a player wearing that helmet. It was a clear helmet. Tenite is very similar to acrylic, so the helmets were clear, and the people looking at the newspaper could see the webbed suspension design. It was a very futuristic, very strange-looking thing compared to any other helmet people had seen before. And that blurb went like this, quote, "Latest in football fashion is this plastic helmet of shockproof design introduced this season by Northwestern. The new helmet is made of tough plastic. Advantages claimed are lighter weight, 8 ounces less than a leather helmet, and greater protection. The player's head does not touch the shell but rests in a webbed suspension from the plastic. School colors are painted inside the transparent shell." End quote. Yeah, it was a clear, almost acrylic-like helmet, and since you're painting the colors on the inside, the paint doesn't chip off when they have collisions. And so that was the 1940 football season, a surprisingly successful one for Northwestern, for Stanford, and for the plastic helmet. It's been said that the hardest part about being on top is staying there. So after a successful 1940 season, how do Shaughnessy and the Stanford team and Halas and his Bears follow that up? Well, for Stanford, they lost a couple of star players, and before the season even started, Shaughnessy predicted they would lose a couple of games. And they did lose a couple of games, and going into their last game of the season, Stanford was in a 3-way tie for first place in the Pacific. They needed to win their final game of the season against California. They didn't. They didn't even put up a touchdown or a point at all. They lost 16-0. But a week after that game, the world would change after Japan bombs Pearl Harbor. And even though Shaughnessy was looking like he may have a dynasty run on his hands at Stanford, he ended up leaving Stanford after that 1941 season because he thought that Stanford might suspend the football program because of wartime. So he took a job offer that came from Maryland. After he left, Stanford did play in the 1942 season, but suspended football for 1943, 44, and 45. Even though Shaughnessy didn't punch his ticket to the Rose Bowl a second year in a row, the Bears did go to the championship game in 1941. The Bears would defeat the New York Giants by a score of 37-9. Scoring the game-winning touchdown, and the touchdown after that, was one of Clark Shaughnessy's star players at Stanford in 1940, Norm Stanley. The game was played 2 weeks after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and within months, most of the players and personnel involved with both teams would be entering the war effort, including George Halas himself. 2 players in this game would end up being killed in action throughout the war. Young Busey of the Chicago Bears was killed during the invasion of Lingayen Gulf in the Philippines. Jack Lummis of the New York Giants was part of the first wave of Marines to attack Iwo Jima. A couple of weeks into that battle, he was put in charge of the E Company's rifle platoon. The accounts of what he did there is incredible. He was attacking pillboxes on his own, one after another. He'd get hit with shrapnel and wouldn't slow down a bit. As he was heading back to the line to rejoin his troops, he did end up stepping on a landmine and was mortally wounded. He would be posthumously rewarded the Medal of Honor. 70,000 Marines landed at Iwo Jima. Only 22 of them would be awarded the Medal of Honor, which is 1/4 of the total of Medals of Honor the Marine Corps has received in its entire history. Jack Loomis was one of those 22 Marines to be rewarded the Medal of Honor for Iwo Jima, and of those 22 Medal of Honor recipients, only 11 were alive to receive that medal. Innovation that started in Chicago would spread throughout the football world. The T formation and the plastic helmet both caught on quick as coaches all across the country hoped to get the same advantage as the folks we just talked about. But let me put in a disclaimer here, or clarify this. This all worked not because of just the plastic helmet. It was a key contributing factor, but so were the coaches, the players, and the innovators. Whether we're talking about evolution or massive success, it never comes from one thing. It comes from many things, all coming together, interacting in just the right way, at just the right time. If you want to blow out a team 73-0, you need Shaughnessy and Halas and John Sos scheming plays, but you also need talent like Sid Luckman and others. If a mid-level talent high school player tries those risky plays, tries the T formation, he's going to get destroyed sooner or later. So the T formation starts to be implemented just about everywhere, but talented players aren't just about everywhere. So this meant that coaches were going to be looking for better, harder, and stronger protection to adapt to the changes that were coming along in the game. With the adaptation of these new styles and protections, the game just gets faster and more skilled. Busier backfields, more men in motion, more people trying to push through the line on their own instead of just doing these slow, boring, 1-yard gain mass plays. It was high-velocity hits. It was highfalutin action. And it all came from this moment of time where innovation was coming out of Chicago. And demand for the plastic helmet was rising at the same exact time as the popularity of the T formation. And I don't think it was a coincidence. As we get into the late 1940s, into the 50s and 60s, injuries start to become more and more frequent, or starting to pile up, and the fatalities are as well. And so the critics are coming out of the woodwork again, and there are two things that are getting mentioned a lot. But I want to read from an article that circled across the country in 1962. It was in a lot of newspapers all over the country, but I found it in the Beaver County Times that was published on Friday, January 12, 1962. Quote, "A Connecticut doctor representing the American Medical Association's Committee on the Medical Aspects of Sports has deplored 2 practices on the football field as contributing to major injuries to gridiron players." End quote. The article would go on to name those 2 factors: plastic helmets and the T formation. And that most likely isn't due to any maliciousness from anybody we've talked about here or anybody overall. It's just that the plastic helmet was taking on everywhere because of the successes that I pointed out throughout this episode. In fact, I can quote Shaughnessy himself on an issue like this one, because he has said, quote, "My goal in football is not to annihilate the opponent, it's to advance the ball." End quote. The game was just getting faster, stronger, more popular. The game changed during this era that we've just covered here. The plastic helmet brought us into a new era, the T formation brought us into a new era, and those two really did enable one another. So as we just talked about, the NFL championship game ends in the middle of December in 1941. America is clearly entering the war at this time, and we're talking about players going off to war. Well, this new plastic helmet is going to be going off to war as well. In that year, 1941, a paratrooper officer near Fort Benning, Georgia, happened to walk by a sporting goods store that had a Riddell plastic helmet sitting in the window, and that caught his eye. This new, incredible innovation was already being advertised and touted as being such a key part in Northwestern's surprising and successful season. This right here enables victory. I'm just kind of paraphrasing the mindset at the time. Anyway, this officer said this would be perfect for our troops because we're looking for a different type of helmet that can withstand everything that goes on when you're dropping into combat from an airplane. With a couple of modifications, this is the thing. And it would be. And he wasn't the only ranking officer that saw a Riddell plastic helmet and said, you know what, this is perfect for our war effort. And so the Riddell plastic helmet, in one form or another, would be heading to the front lines in World War II. But that's going to have to wait till next episode of How Gear Changed the Game. Thanks for listening to this episode of How Gear Changed the Game. If you liked what you heard, if you're really enjoying this, or if you think you might enjoy more episodes as we continue to develop the style and rein this thing in to get it better and better and pack more punch for you, please subscribe to the podcast right now. You'd be doing us a big help, and, it lets you know when we have new episodes coming out, and we still have a few more of these football helmet ones coming out, and we're going to have more episodes about more pieces of gear in more sports where we do these types of deep dives. So please, subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks to Ken Crippen for joining us on the podcast today. He's a great guy with a great source of material. You can find out more about what he does at pro-football-academy.com. Thanks, Ken. Thanks to a couple other great resources, helmethut.com, antiquefootball.com, and helmethistory.com. More of our sources can be found at howgearchangedthegame.com. Disclaimer about the whole show, I call this an exploration. This is me telling you about interesting things involving gear and the growth of the game and the evolution of the game. And while I try to point out interesting things and interesting correlations, I'm not trying to make any sort of 100% point. I'm just trying to share history, the interesting stories of history, and how the game and gear grew into what it is today. To quote Vince Lombardi, "I am not an expert. The only difference between you and I is that I've studied this more than you have. But I'm sure there is someone out there who has studied this more than I have. And if you are kind about it, instead of just raking me across the coals, if you have any suggestions, any ideas for future episodes, or just want to say hi, our email is howgearchangedthegame@gmail.com. I've been your host, Alex Kindig Sherman. I am the executive producer, writer, researcher, dog walker of How Gear Changed the Game. Man, do I love this stuff. I'm looking forward to next episode when we learn about when the football helmet went to war.